Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the new jobs protection scheme announced by the Chancellor Rishi Sunak, as well as the politicking as he seeks to deflect accusations of finally catching up to what opposition parties have been calling for months. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So there are a few things to talk about here. One, what is the scheme that Sunak has announced? Two, is it really a U-turn? After all, he says it's not, and, you know, a Tory minister wouldn't lie. And three, how will it affect the precarious situation faced by businesses due to COVID in general and the government's measures specifically? So the scheme, in essence, takes the form of the following. So for a worker to be eligible, they need to be working, actively working, for at least a third of their normal hours. So as far as I can tell, if you're still furloughed, completely furloughed, because even with the furlough scheme, you were still allowed to do some work. You just weren't working your full hours. So in a situation like that, you know, the government have told the employer that they can't open their business to work at all. They've said, look, you know, you're not opening because we've got a pandemic on, hadn't you noticed? And then you're out of luck. So this scheme's not going to help you. I hear universal credit is a thing. If you're a Conservative voter, then you are about to learn what you've paid for with your vote. If you voted for someone suitable, then you have my sympathies. All I can suggest is writing to your MP a lot. But let's say that you are working at least a third of your normal hours. Or your employer can at least arrange this. Maybe you're not now, but maybe they can say, well, we can do this. Or fiddle it some way to make it appear that way. Then your employer will have to pay you for the hours that you are working, which will of course be at least a third. But all of the hours that you're working, you need to be paid your normal rate. So that's going to be at least a third of your salary. So in terms of the other 2/3 of your salary, well, your employer has to pay a third of that. So the third of the 2/3, 2/9. And the government will pay another third of that 2/3, which leaves you with a gap of the rest, or about 22% of your total salary missing, which I kept seeing being reported as 23%, but I think that was because the correspondents writing it up weren't too good with thirds and kept rounding down before they should have done. Either that or it's the Chancellor who made the error, but I suspect not. Either way, it's just under a quarter of your pay. That if you are just working the bare minimum a third of the hours, that's gone. So that's going to be just under a quarter of your pay gone. Now, has to be said, you know, like I said, that is based on you working a third. If you are working more than a third of your normal hours, then you'll still, you know, not be getting your full amount of pay, but you'd be losing proportionally less of your income. And you could argue there will be some people on this scheme, it could work out better than the furlough scheme. So, as this is quite clearly different to the furlough scheme that we did have in operation, is it really a U-turn to suddenly announce this? The Chancellor insists it isn't. And he's actually attacking opposition MPs for claiming that he's finally acting when he's pointed out, well, what you wanted was an extension of the furlough scheme. And this isn't it. Which is not entirely true. Yes, indeed, they have been calling for that. But the furlough scheme to them was jobs protection. For example, Labour and the SNP have both called for targeted support. Now, the furlough scheme as it is at the moment is not actually targeted. It's just, look, whoever, whatever, under whatever circumstances. You know, both of the main opposition parties have actually called for, they've actually said, look, if you're not going to extend it as you're doing it now, okay, fine. But can we at least extend it for sectors that cannot get back to work, but would be able to in a year's time? We're not talking about businesses that aren't viable. They just can't operate in this pandemic right now. But if you get on top of it, then next year they'd be okay. Just keep them going until then. That's all they've asked for, and that is effectively what this is attempting to do. So it is still a U-turn, because the scheme may be different, But, for example, the Chancellor is saying he's basing it on the German Kurzarbeit, which was famously brought into being in the wake of the financial crash just over a decade ago. Has been used in Germany before then. It's got a much longer history. But that's when it became very, very famous, because Germany stood out after the 2008 crash as being a country that actually managed the situation without massive numbers of job losses. But the government weren't planning, the British government were not planning any support at all. They said, look, the furlough scheme needs to end. There was no, but we're going to do something else. There was none of that. It was going to end, and that's all there was to it. Going to end, that's all there was to it. Also, the government don't get to crow about this. This thing that for most is not as good as the furlough scheme, because the furlough scheme protected sort of everyone actually there was a big hole that it didn't protect. Mostly people that had just newly gone into self-employment. But it protected a lot of workers, the bulk of workers. But with this scheme, there's a whole millions of people just not going to be helped at all. And it will cause more businesses to go under and more jobs to be lost. It's just that it won't cost quite so many jobs and businesses as were going to be lost with the government plan up to this point. So how do I know that the government weren't planning this all along and just didn't want to make an announcement until they'd worked it all out? Well, it's quite simple. Because in theory, yeah, absolutely, you could say, well, they don't want to announce anything, and then what they announce has to be worse than what they were talking about. And there's obviously arguments in Cabinet. They wanted to make sure they've got agreement before they announced anything. They weren't doing that, and it's quite simple to say why. First of all, they did not say they were even planning on doing something. They didn't have to talk about details. They could have just said, look, furlough scheme is ending, end of October, but we are planning on something to help. And everyone isn't going to get their expectations up with this Conservative government when it comes to help. The help is not usually very much. But they could have at least made an announcement. When it comes to keeping businesses going, you need to give them the confidence in tough times that they have a safety net. The government were not even making vague promises about such a safety net until this week. Up until last week, the furlough scheme was ending, and that was all there was to it. But then secondly, the most obvious indicator is that Rishi Sunak, when he was announcing these measures, has completely torn up his budget to do it. A budget that was only recently passed. And that is an issue in itself. So the government have announced this scheme to Parliament. Okay, fine, that's how it works. But they are not seeking Parliament's approval. Well, that's not how it's supposed to work. They've taken questions. Sure, they didn't just come there, say their piece and bugger off. They took questions. But there's no debate followed by a vote. It's all going through on the statutory instruments that have been pissing off even Conservative MPs, annoyed that they are being bypassed in terms of the governing of this country. But the budget that Rishi Sunak is tearing up in order to facilitate this proposal, and as I say, the fact he's tearing up his budget means that they were not planning this when that budget was submitted very recently. I mean, that budget Parliament did debate and did vote for. So the government, just from a constitutional point of view, has just ripped up something voted for by Parliament without even asking their permission to do so. Now, I'm not saying that Parliament wouldn't have voted for this change, but they're not even asking them to. Parliament have voted for a thing, government have just torn it up. So, from that point of view, we can see that it's not just undertakings with the EU that Boris Johnson and his posse will rip up unilaterally. They do it with their own parliament as well. But I'm having a pop at the measures in isolation, bear in mind. If it's a case of this or nothing, and it was going to be nothing, then of course this is better than nothing. It will help people. But it's a bit like their COVID measures. When they announce COVID measures, you go, well, does this objectively help? Yes, it does. But they're not as good as they could or should be. And because they're not as effective as they should be, they're going to cause longer term damage as a result. Sunak is justifying the lack of ambition in this scheme by saying that it will help those in viable jobs. So what he's saying is, if this scheme doesn't help you, then you aren't in a viable job. Never mind if it's just the fact that you work for a company with seasonal highs and lows, and that this year's season was completely knackered by the government's restrictions on you, and you now don't have that peak to get you through a lower winter to wait for next year's peak, which hopefully can go ahead. It could be that the government restrictions right now are actively preventing your business from taking off again. But you'd be fine, if the company could just be allowed to carry on until again next year, once we've got through the pandemic, hopefully. Against the background of other countries doing more to protect jobs as well. I mean, what it seems to me, to be fair to say, is that it's our government that isn't viable. Because how come, I keep having to say this, how come other governments can do what we say we can't do? So how much will this announcement actually help? So the way I see it is the government make a calculation when it comes to these sort of things. So they don't mind screwing people over. We've seen that. I mean, hell, even the sort of Tories that we'd now tear our arm off to bring back, John Major, Michael Heseltine, Ken Clarke, would still screw a lot of people over. So the calculation for these Conservatives is just how many can we afford to screw over and still stay in power? Obviously, what's happened in the last week is they've run the figures and decided that the people that they were going to be buggering up by ending furlough is above that threshold. So they've done just enough, not to actually help the economy, not to preserve jobs, but just enough to keep enough workers and enough businesses stable that the critical mass of discontent is averted. The Chancellor said we cannot extend furlough because we cannot afford it. Like I said, it's funny how other countries, including Germany, could. Maybe if we didn't shell out so much money to Tory donors and friends for little or no return, we'd maybe have enough to be able to afford it then. Boris Johnson boasted about introducing creative and imaginative measures in order to protect jobs. But all they've actually done is to take the German system, wipe some dog crap over it, to make it look like Boris Johnson did it. I mean, I'm not sure how it is either creative or imaginative to take somebody else's work and then submit a copy of it. But there it is. I mean, it is good news for those of whom it will help. It's unfortunate for those who will access the scheme, but it won't be as good for them as furlough. Remember, even furlough has meant a drop in wages for many people. Remembering that there are countries like France is one of them, where for the lowest paid workers, they got all of their income supported. And absolutely devastating, of course, for those that it will cut out completely and not be replaced at all. And unfortunately, for those people, you are amongst a number that the government thinks it can afford to dump into universal credit. Finally, it appears that even this set of measures represents a tenuous compromise in Cabinet. People did not fail to notice that Boris Johnson was not in Parliament to support his Chancellor's speech. Now, when a Cabinet Minister gives an important speech, the Prime Minister would be expected to be there to lend their support, the support of government. Now, the fact that Boris Johnson was not there strongly suggests that he does not want to be associated with it. Though I don't know whether that's because for him it doesn't go far enough or it goes too far. No idea. Perhaps he was just annoyed that it wasn't creative or imaginative like he'd promised. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.